Hello, everybody. So I'm Antonio Roman Alcala. I'm here representing the Permaculture and Social Equity team. We're a team from around the country. We have Ross Martin, design from New York, Communitecture from Portland, Pandora Thomas from Berkeley, Base Landscape Architecture from San Francisco, the Urban Permaculture Institute also from San Francisco, Brown and Caldwell from the East Bay, and myself, I'm born and raised in San Francisco. So you can see we're largely rooted here in the Bay Area, and that might inform sort of our design approach, where we see communities, and especially vulnerable communities, not just as potential partners in designing for resilience, but actually as leaders in their own right. And this is something you will see throughout our design opportunities. Who has this is mine. So this is our first slide. Where do I point this thing? So this is why we think that resilient by design should be resilient by design by everybody. And our interest, of course, we've been told we should be thinking a lot about sea level rise and the impact on some of this larger urban infrastructure. And of course, we are concerned about these things. But we're really more interested in how do we connect what's going on at the community level to these issues. And we know, as we've talked about a lot, that there's sort of different kinds of issues that people are facing, both chronic stressors as well as these sort of acute shocks relating to some of this larger scale infrastructure. And we believe that it's really important to focus on those most vulnerable communities and what do they think about the problems, what do they define as the problems, and what do they define as the solutions. And by focusing on that, we can actually build a sort of collective capacity to deal with some of these larger issues. Similarly, we know that there's different scales at which solutions are rolled out. And so at the community scale, people are able to act very immediately, often doing interventions that cost a lot less or are easy to get going. And in the process of so doing, they often end up building capacity, building skills, and building a sort of value system and a culture of resilience, which we think is very required for that sort of 1,000-year long-term vision for creating a totally different kind of culture for resilience. At the same time, there are clearly limitations to what you can accomplish at the community level, and so it's important also to look at the public scale, which might include city government, city agencies, regional agencies, and so on. There's a lot that needs to be done at that scale, but they tend to take longer. So our interest, of course, is how do we link and unite these two kinds of efforts more effectively. So stepping back a second, we are the Permaculture and Social Equity team, and we don't have time to go into what permaculture is, but you can see that some of the principles by which permaculture designers design are listed there, and a really pertinent and important one for this context is that permaculture focuses on what we call small and slow solutions. We feel that making very big moves, very top-down moves, can inadvertently have negative consequences on the communities and the ecologies we're supposed to be serving. And so we prefer to find those solutions which work at that small and slow level and actually amplify them, build them up. So this leads us back to our general theme, which is we don't want to see people just be engaged as communities. We want to see them lead the process of design. And these are some of the outcomes that happen from that. This isn't just some abstract, great idea in theory. This is something that we've lived as designers and as activists. So for myself, I helped found Alamany Farm here in San Francisco. Has anyone ever heard of it? A few people. So Alamany Farm was a guerrilla garden. We had no permission from the city government to do what we did initially. Now it is considered sort of a jewel of the urban agriculture scene here in San Francisco. We also partner with many other similarly volunteer-based, grassroots-based community farm projects in San Francisco to actually change the city government law around urban agriculture and to actually change state law to support urban agriculture. So those are things that happen at the community level and get absorbed. Similarly, Ross Martin from our team, after Hurricane Sandy, developed some bioswales in his community garden. And these were so successful that him and his partners are actually given $2 million by the federal government to expand these bioswales into other spaces across the city. So these are examples that show how social innovation at the community level can lead to a greater government role in designing for and engendering resilience. We think that there's a lot of synergies potential building upon what communities are already doing. At the same time, I want to recognize that government doesn't always have a positive role and in fact can stymie some of these innovations or can even be responsible for the unresilience in the first place. And I was just informed today that there's a meeting between the San Francisco Mayor's Office of Housing and the Midtown Apartments, which were intended to be, it's 139 units that were intended to be owned by tenants through a co-op housing structure. And unfortunately, the city is now basically trying to displace the longtime residents through increasing their rent by 30% to up to 300% rent increases. And these are low income, mostly Black and immigrant tenants. So there's examples where this is tension. It's not always automatic that governments partner with communities, but we are clearly very interested in seeing how we can partner together. So our first design opportunity is, how do we do this? How do we build upon what is already being done around the Bay Area? And it's called regional resilience from the ground up. There's some of the permaculture principles that the design inspires. And you'll see that, of course, we have this in our own personal backgrounds, this working at the community level, but we also saw it on our tours, and here are some of the places that we saw folks at the community level already building resilience themselves. So the plan is pretty much this. We want to work with communities to map and assess what already is happening at this community level, to understand both what people are doing, about what issues, what is succeeding, what is not succeeding, and importantly, what are the gaps? What do these folks who are doing this actually think is necessary to build up from their work? Importantly, for a lot of other resiliency stakeholders like governments or like RBD itself, we need to understand how to work with these communities. And so we want to have this process also develop a series of recommendations for these other stakeholders about how communities want to be worked with. What does that look like? And through this, we are also walking the talk, let's say. We heard a lot from communities about how they felt left out of the RBD process. Why aren't they on the design teams? So during this phase, we would hire what we're calling community resilience ambassadors, who'd be leadership from all 9 of the counties to take part in co-designing and co-implementing this entire process of mapping and assessment. So this is about building capacity. At the same time, it's saying that we have something to learn from the communities while they're learning from us as designers. This is just an example of what it might look like afterwards. You'd assess and see all these different resilience infrastructure being put in by folks, as well as we would know all these details about their ethnic composition, their funding, et cetera. And importantly, like I mentioned, we would know what are the gaps, what are the things that they feel is needed to expand their success. And to do that, what we're going to do is follow up the design process with what we're calling the Summer of Resilience. And this would take place in the summer of 2018, where we partner with 5 to 10 of the organizations identified through the mapping process and co-construct these workshops where we would actually implement hands-on infrastructure, such as you can see some rain barrels there. But we wouldn't just limit it to actually doing some small-scale infrastructure. We would want to have expanded eco-literacy, where folks are able to connect what they're doing to these larger issues so they can understand the rain barrels in relationship to the upstream infrastructure, as well as the vulnerability of, say, wastewater treatment plants at the bay's edge and sea level rise. And so there's many partners who'd be involved in that. And just ending on our timeline again, this is not something we expect to just end through the RBD process. We'd also like to embed this in an organizational home, and we have steps throughout the way to identify funding and different mechanisms to actually continue this process so it can form a sort of upward spiral where every year we have more and more people involved, and this map is being used both by the communities themselves as well as various stakeholders who are interested in how do we build out a culture of resilience and resiliency infrastructure throughout the Bay. I'll just pass it over to Patricia now.
Good afternoon, Patricia Algara with Bay's Landscape Architecture. And in addition to this larger framework, we're also looking at 2 site-specific ideas for this challenge. So I'm going to start by telling you the story of the language of water in San Francisco, particularly in Isaias Creek. This is a site that we selected because we feel a very strong connection to the site. A lot of us are from there, have connections to the community work, and so we decided to focus there. The potable water of San Francisco comes from Hetch Hetchy, and it crosses 4 major fault lines. It's not only a threat for that, but it's also a threat in fire. It's also a threat of drought. There's many issues with the water coming to San Francisco. San Francisco also gets almost 11 billion gallons of rainwater. That water could be captured and stored and reused, but instead, most of it goes down the drain, a drain that is a combined sewage system. So that means that it gets polluted, and the system cannot handle that amount of water. So usually that water backflows, goes up the drains and into the homes of San Francisco. The Southeast Treatment Plant is located at the base of the Isaias watershed. That neighborhood is a neighborhood that usually carries the brunt of these floodings. And this is how that looks like in the streets of San Francisco, in the homes. And usually the city of San Francisco has to pay for the damage of those homes. So we like to think about what this watershed used to be like. So Isaias Creek used to run year-round. It used to provide 85% of the water for the city of San Francisco. Salmon used to swim up that stream, and the whole area was covered with cherry trees. That's where the name Isaias comes from. But then it got culverted, so the freeway could go above it. The City of San Francisco Public Utilities Commission has been already doing a lot of work with the community, has had an incredible process to realize what are the potential solutions for this water problem, for the flooding. And a lot of ideas have come out of that. We would like to incorporate those ideas and work with what has already been done in the community. However, this work was only looking at flooding from rain of a 5-hour storm in a 3-year 5-hour storm. So we know that there are other issues that we need to look at. We need to look at drought, we need to look at sea level rise. And you can see right here that at the 6-foot flooding, the treatment facility is not going to be flooded, but it's right on the edge, and the outpour of water into the bay will be flooded. The treatment facility is not going to work when that seawater comes up. And at 16 foot, that whole area is going to be flooded. So our idea is one of decentralization of the stormwater treatment. We would like to work with the city of San Francisco to figure out slow and small solutions that can work upstream so that slowly we can start to reduce the amount of water that's going into that treatment facility, and we can divert it and treat it upstream in smaller ways. We would do this working with some of the local communities that we already have an established connection with. This is a list of some of the people that we have already been working with, that we already know, and that want to do alternative solutions. We would also like to do this as a collaborative process with all of the stakeholders, so working with the city and everyone else who is involved in this process. Right now, we find ourselves at this place where we have these hypothetical ideas of what could happen with the Resilience by Design Challenge. But the other step would be to identify funding mechanisms and identify all of the stakeholders within the area so that we can work into a leadership training. That way we can identify all of the different concepts. We can identify new designs and then implement those designs. Once they're implemented, we can look at all the lessons learned, what's working, what's not working, how can we implement it, and from that create a new paradigm. That new paradigm then would be a process that could be replicated and adopted by the city, and we can create new projects. So we have 3 scales of this. At the household scale, we're looking at a typical single-family home in San Francisco. The potable water that comes into a typical home, about a third of that goes down the toilet. So our idea at this home scale is to have composting toilets, gray water reuse, and rainwater catchment. This will save about 75% of the water in a home scale. We also want to implement other stormwater solutions that will allow water to permeate and less water to go down the drain. This will mean that about 25% of the water will be diverted from the treatment facility. At the public scale, we want to look at schools, because at school level, we can also have a larger body of students. We would also look at composting toilets, because that makes we could save about 60% of the water. And we also want to look at a potential of having large infrastructure for cisterns underground where we can capture water and have that water available for emergency use. At the watershed scale, we want to look at daylighting the creek to make space for water, and looking especially at the Alamany Farmers Market, which we think this is a great place where we can provide a beautiful space, have access to nature, have access to that creek, have a much better, vibrant space for communities to gather. We would also propose to have a flooding area underneath the freeway. That way we allow the water to flood and we give it more space. We also can collect it underneath the farmer's market. And eventually we want to create space for the water to go and slowly transition the industry so that we can create space for wetlands in the area that's going to be flooded.
Hi, I'm Mark Lakeman with Communitecture. So we have a very social process-oriented team. Our third opportunity is located in the northern extent of the bay in the San Pablo Bay, actually. We're very fortunate to have a number of team members able to tour together from site to site almost the entire time. And so our site selection process was very immediate. And for us, of course, we were learning along the way about the different vulnerabilities and the different sort of states of the communities, their various planning efforts that were or were not underway, their concerns. We were heartened by how many people were becoming aware, and we were also inspired by the amount of initiatives that had already been kind of enacted as tests. So that was brilliant. At the same time, we were looking for communities that weren't just vulnerable, but ones that were capable of getting started. That's a key component for us, being such a socially process-oriented group. We arrived on Mare Island, and it was immediately inspiring to us, especially because it's a direct connection to Vallejo, which was one such community with apparent capacity. As we were touring the vast infrastructure and looking at it as an opportunity to match the needs of the region and the local city of Vallejo to the resource, which is frankly planned in many different documents that we've studied. At the same time, this was the day of the Las Vegas massacre, so we were deeply affected, and the cemetery kind of inspired some new thinking in us about possibilities for the region that might become urgent and imminent. So looking at the different conditions here, of course the island is almost inundated with the combination of fluvial events, sea level rise, and storm conditions. Definitely it merits protection because there's a deep commitment to that infrastructure to preserve it and also repurpose it. So we identified areas of possible strategic adaptation and then thought about resilience projects to enact in those locations. The relationship of Mare Island to Vallejo is very direct. They're part of the same city, and at the same time, as it's a very special relationship, also clearly the withdrawal of the naval base has had a tremendous impact upon the economy and the social culture of Vallejo to great detrimental effect. One neighborhood in particular here, immediately adjacent, is a very activated community in many respects, but also very distressed on almost every kind of social, environmental, economic indicator, health-related. Looking at the infrastructure around the perimeter especially, it's very much of an architectural problem of matching what we need to do with what resources we have. But also upland, there's wildlife and there's various different amenities. In fact, it's an archaeological Disneyland on this site. So we started to try to sort of cluster these pieces and see how they might exist in relation. Looking at them vertically across the landscape, starting with the water's edge, we began by repurposing the causeway into a regional aquatic transportation sort of access linkage point, and then up from there, repurposing a cluster of architectural remnants into an outdoor education facility, moving up from there, an extension of the existing cemetery to become a regional memorial, which we'll show you in a second, and then from there repurposing underutilized open space, controversially including a golf course, to become a place of energy generation and food production, powering as many as almost 2,000 homes and producing tons and tons of food, locally sourced food. So looking at our design opportunities on this site, to the west, we have about 150,000 square feet of buildings that are really in quite great shape, and we're proposing this as an equity and livelihood-oriented village for refugee and vulnerable populations to be able to come, earn a living wage, live together with their families while, we're hoping, we're projecting that we would be building resilience technologies for decentralized systems and at the same time growing food for the larger region as an economic basis, and this is what that might look like, just beginning with the existing architecture and then creating systems that connect things together. And when we say equity, we mean a place for everyone to be able to have a voice and have a meaningful role. Up on the top of the island, a regional memorial center that brings people from the cemetery through a processional sort of contoured path with places along the way leading to an architecture of the sky, which really is about taking advantage of the views while we facilitate community gathering and many other sort of functions that we think are appropriate for a location like this. And then finally, there's a cluster of remnant architecture at the southeast edge, which has already been identified with great enthusiasm as being a potential arts village. We think that it could also be linked with ecology so that it has an educational basis, certainly about production, exhibition, retail. Ultimately, though, the whole idea is to create a spectacular reinvention of the island that serves the entire region, all of Vallejo, of course, to revitalize its economy, provide a lot of housing, living wage jobs, while we attract people from around the world. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. So we're going to take about a 20 to 25-minute break now, so people can stretch, check your email, go to the bathroom, and then we'll be back for the final set of presentations. So we'll see you soon.